Welcome to this online session. My name is Anthony Vanni Capildeo, writer-in-residence at the University of York's Department of English and Related Literature from the University of York, and I'm delighted to host this session today. Joining me today is Shash Trevett, poet and the translator of Tamil poetry into English, Vidyan Ravinthiran, poet and associate professor in English at Harvard University, and Neil Astley, editor of Bloodaxe Books. We'll start the session with a short panel discussion between our speakers, who will introduce and lead this discussion on Out of Sri Lanka, the first ever anthology of Sri Lankan and diasporic poetry, which features over 300 poems written in English or translated from Tamil and Sinhala. We will then hear a number of poetry readings in both Tamil, Sinhala and English from the contributors to the anthology, including Shash and Vidyan. I am delighted to now hand over to Shash, Vidyan and Neil.
Thank you very much. Well, one thing I'd like to start off by saying is that this is an anthology of poetry from Sri Lanka, but it's also very much a project which comes out of the north of England. The book has 3 editors, Shash, Trevett, Vidyan Ravinthiran, and also Seneviratne, who's abroad and unable to join us today. They all are from Derbyshire or Yorkshire, although Shash came from Sri Lanka during the Civil War, and Vidyan's now teaches at Harvard. So I think this is a wonderful example of Northern internationalism, which I think deserves great support from everyone because of that. This is the anthology, and it has around 100 poets in it, and it's been a book which has been in the making for 2 or 3 years now, and has involved a great deal of research by the 3 editors working together. And perhaps we could start off by, if I could start off by asking them about how it was this book came together in the first place.
Thanks so much, Neil, and thank you for making it possible for us to create the book and to put it out there. How did it come about in the first? I think I'd sometimes get messages from people and they'd say, do you want to be included in this anthology of Indian poetry? And then I'd say, well, technically, our heritage is Sri Lankan, and they'd sort of very quietly, sort of tactfully back off. It's like, okay, you can't actually be in this anthology. So it got me to thinking a little bit, and I was studying and writing about Indian poetry, and there have been several quite important anthologies of Indian poetry, including one edited by Arvind Krishna Malhotra. And we just didn't seem to really have the equivalent for Sri Lankan poetry. So it made me kind of curious about, there must be all this really great stuff out there, maybe hidden in archives. So getting together with Shash and Seni, that was my first thought, to sort of recover things that had been lost or had gone out of print. But then chatting with Shash and Seni, it became clear that we were kind of creating this literature too, that it was appropriate for us to put a call out and for new poems and to include poems in the anthology which had never actually been published before. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Shash.
No, Vidyan contacted, this was Vidyan's brainchild really, and then he contacted me and I was delighted to come on board. But originally Vidyan wanted Tamil poets writing in English, and we soon realized that Tamil poets don't write in English, they write in Tamil almost exclusively for various reasons. And so it soon turned into a trilingual anthology, although in English translation. And then we asked Seni to join us and access the Sinhala side of things.
Could you say something about the cultural and political background of the book and of the poems?
So what we wanted to do was, you have these demographics or these groupings of people who have often been pitched against each other historically in terms of the Civil War. So what we wanted to do in the book was to kind of create enlivening juxtapositions rather than siloing off those languages one from the other. So we decided to arrange the poets alphabetically rather than create separate English, Tamil, and Sinhala sections. And I guess in terms of history and politics, there's the Civil War and all of that, but also what Sri Lanka is kind of going through at the moment, which is this economic crisis, which has led to all sorts of things, and to a kind of, I think, a kind of genuinely radical social rebellion on a street level. Does that feel like, Shash?
Yeah, although in a way it's sort of quietened down a bit, and things are quite worrying. The direction the government is taking in sort of censoring the media and journalists and anyone who criticizes them, including a comedian recently. But I think the other thing we found is that there's so many people had left the island during the Civil War. There was such a drain of talent and lives, and so we had to cast our net very wide and bring in the diaspora, which is not predominantly Tamil, although a lot of Tamil poets are now living abroad. But there are Sinhala poets as well who are based in the US or Australia. So as soon as we started including diaspora in poetry, the sort of anthologies changed, because it wasn't just about Sri Lanka or rooted in Sri Lanka. It was also bringing in what it felt like to be a poet in exile or an immigrant experience. So we could include all of that, which I think makes the anthology more interesting.
Now,
Yeah.
Shash, you were the only one of the three editors who was actually living in Sri Lanka prior to working together on this anthology. How familiar were you when you were in Sri Lanka with the poets that you've now unveiled?
Not at all. So, I think partly because I was still very young, but I think it was a throwback of colonial times. We learned, I mean, I can recite Blake and Wordsworth by heart still, because I was made to memorize English poetry from England. I had no idea what a daffodil looked like. I'd never seen snow before in my life, but I knew all about it, and John Masefield as well. So yeah, Tamil poetry was only Thiruvalluvar, who is this great ancient poet who wrote loads of sort of aphorisms that people still use in everyday life. So we knew about him, and poetry was sort of riddles and proverbs that we used to be told by our grandparents. A great family pastime was to sit and be told proverbs and riddles, which are very poetic in the way they're written. And that sort of pervades the culture. But as far as reading actual poets, no, I had none at all.
And you found it quite difficult to get hold of some of the work, didn't you? I understand from working with you on this.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the archival efforts, trying to get from libraries books which are long out. But I think there are also problems to do with, books that were originally put out in, by presses which were little more than printing mills, really, and the accessibility of those books, the quality of those books, the reliability of the poems that you get from them in terms of the wording and everything. And then I think also discovering that some poets, I mean, using the Sri Lankan and diasporic poets, and using that phrase broadly, that maybe kind of dropped off the grid, or maybe didn't even really consider themselves poets anymore. Like, we had a couple of occasions where we had some fantastic poems by poets who then said, we don't really want them to be republished. And that's very, very different to most anthologizing or editing work in the US or the UK, where it's like, you tell a poet, can we use your work? And they're just, yay, please use my work. So there's all these things that maybe sometimes the idea of poets working in quite isolated regions, feeling sort of neglected, poets who haven't really felt part of supportive networks with other writers. And I think one of the things we're hoping is that maybe we've kind of created a network like that, just through the effort to create this anthology, and then maybe there's a way of keeping that alive.
Yeah, and there are some poets you haven't been able to get even any information about whom you've included, not even their dates of birth or when they died, if they're no longer with us.
Yeah, it is remarkable to come across the ungoogleable, right? Or to really find something that has no a poem or someone, a person who writes poems who has no digital trace, and also no real trace in the critical literature around Sri Lankan poetry. There are some poets who were sort of Sri Lankan Anglophone poets, and I think Sri Lankan Tamil poets in particular. We did have a profile that was the outside, but there are other poets who I've just never heard about. So I'm usually started getting it.
All three of you are poets, so I wonder whether you could say something about why it's important to have poet editors working on projects of this kind, anthologies including translations in particular. Maybe Shash could kick that off.
I think, you have a certain ear that you use when you read poetry, and that's something that we used very extensively when we were reading all these poems written in an English or translated into an English that is slightly archaic in its use of English, because it's still, the Sri Lankan English is still uses quite a lot of the stuff that's been left over from colonial times. And so we had to discount what we've learned by being poets in this country and the poetics of the UK scene, and open our ears to a different type of poetics. Having said that, there were still poems that we thought didn't work as poems because they just weren't rooted in any of there was no rhythm, there was no scansion, or those sort of things are the same whichever language base you're reading. And some of the other anthologies that we come across weren't edited by poets, and you could tell the difference because some of the poems that were included weren't really poems. So we had very, very strict guidelines, and Seni was very strict on this, really, about line lengths and things like that, that we did have rules that we followed.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because on the one hand, you don't want to impose these aesthetic standards that one might have that are derived from elsewhere, like I guess the poetry I was reading that shaped me is kind of mid-20th century Anglo-American poetry, on from there. So you don't want to sort of take that and then force everything to fit that template. But at the same time, I think what's really lacking is, in a lot of areas, is a consideration of poetry from the global South, of post-colonial writing, as literature, as something that is aesthetically shaped. And I think that's what the writers want of them. They don't want to be treated as just wounds with tongues in them, as Shakespeare would have it, and they don't want their writing to be merely seen as symptomatic of traumatic times, or as a kind of political journalist. What they want is to be recognized as artists and creators and people who are working with words in an aesthetic way to shape them. So I think in that sense, one has to take that, one has to embrace that risk of interacting aesthetically, even relationships.
Something that I found really refreshing as well. At the moment, there's a lot of discussion going on about sort of trauma porn in poetry, and reading these poets who have actually lived through traumatic times, to see how they transmute that trauma and transform it into something just beautiful, from a position of authority in a way, and a lived experience that they're communicate, that they're communicating to people. We found that really eye-opening. And in a way, I'm really glad this anthology is here so that people have access to, how to write about trauma in a way.
I think it's also worth saying that the book doesn't just cover the period of the Civil War and its aftermath, it goes back decades. And the range of work in the book, it covers all aspects of life. There are poems about the perennial subjects of love and death and family and so on. Would you like to say something about that area of work that you've included?
Sure, I can start to Shash. Well, it's trying to think of the best way to approach it. Well, Blood Axe has put out all sorts of poetry and all sorts of anthologies, but especially with the idea that here is something that a lot of people will want to read. This is something that will be heartening and nourishing for all sorts of groups of people. Like that, a lot of Blood Axe books come under that. I like that. And we wanted to create a book which absolutely, spoke to its cultural moment and was about Sri Lanka and could educate people about history and could put on record atrocities that government has tried to erase from history and all of that. But we didn't want it to just be a book, about those sorts of traumas. And we wanted it to be expressive of all sorts of things. As you say, Neil, things that are very specific to Sri Lanka and also things that are less specific and which even touch on, we've all learned not to talk about this, but, the universal, sort of close to the universal as one could get. And about the range, and I guess I should say something just very quickly about how we, the time coordinates. At first, we did see it as post-independence anthology, right? And that's primarily what it is. But there are moments where we've gone a little bit earlier because there are a couple of writers, George Cate, who was a kind of cubist painter who was writing in the 30s, kind of invents a modern or modernist idiom for Anglophone Sri Lankan poetry. And also Tambi Mutu, who's a kind of a figure still to be reckoned with, who came to England and founded Poetry London, which is not the Poetry London we know about, but different poetry. So we did a few jaunts earlier than the Valley of Independence, but mostly it's post-independence.
Can I just add also, we're doing this event in New York Festival of Ideas, which has as its theme, rediscover, reimagine, rebuild. And from what you've both been saying, it seems to me that Out of Sri Lanka very much fits into that way of looking at ideas and of looking at culture and poetry in particular. Would you like to give any feedback on that?
Shash.
I think Sri Lanka is obviously going through a very important time at the moment where they are trying to rebuild the country, not helped by government forces at all, but the people themselves want to rebuild. But it's important not to just move on, because you have to address what has happened before. And there is this wish to brush everything under the carpet. So in that way, by having this anthology, which states quite clearly, and it's there now for on record and it's out in the world, that these things happened, whether it's the repressive crackdown on JVP uprisings that the Sinhala people suffered, or the repressive suffering of the Tamil people, it's there on record, and subsequent governments have to make amends to the people of Sri Lanka, and in order for the country to rebuild. That's me thinking about Sri Lanka.
Well, thank you for that. We're now going to move on to actually see and hear some of the poets who are in the anthology. Shash and Vidyan are going to read some of their own poems from the anthology. But before we do that, they've curated some readings, which we'll see on video shortly, by poets in the anthology, some of them reading in Tamil, some of them reading in Sinhala, some of them in English, and there will be on-screen translations and on-screen poems as well for everyone to see. So before that segment starts, could Shash and Vidyan, could you say something about the poets that we're about to see before you yourself do your readings?
Well, we've got a mixture of poets. We asked people to send in recordings, and we've got several, and we've just chosen a few here. So we've got, it starts with Madri Caligula, who is a Colombo-based writer, writing in English, who's young and is an emerging poet. And then we've also got halfway through a Tamil poet and translator, but we're not using his poems in this, just his translation of Chelian, who died in the early 2000s. So Mr. Padmanathan, who has been part of the Tamil poetry scene since sort of the 1940s. So we've got from the new to the old, and everything in between.
Thank you very much. And now the poets.
Last night I dreamed your horse had died, and the dream sat in me like a rock. Do you hear me? A rock, gathered in layers like silt all over me, every inch of my damp skin, until it covered me, and I was a thing of black, dark as a volcano about to spit fire. The dream, a black mood, and your dead horse weighed on me like a dead weight, a body that was not even mine to bury, but had meant the world to you. Your horse was dead, brown mass of wet flesh, and the sea was lapping at the white stringy mane, messy tangle of dead horsehair. Eating with salty lips at his wide, bewildered eyes, no one knew how the horse had died, least of all the horse himself, but there was a frothing at his thick lips bared to show long horse teeth, a horse that had eaten cocaine. Oh, but you had loved that horse once. How much, only I knew. So I, with burning arms, began pulling that lifeless body out to sea. Oh, he was heavy, 10 times as heavy as me, but he was your horse, and your horse was dead. So I must give it a burial fitting, a fitting burial for something you had loved. I pulled, I heaved, and with limbs on fire, I pushed him gently out to his watery grave, and the seething sea took him gladly, with a rush, dragged him in ceremoniously, and swallowed him whole. I felt a sear in my soul, but I knew it would rest his bones. So what, in cold blood? Your steely voice, eyes, pinpricks of ice. Just an animal. Just an animal. It was the horse you loved. Just a miscarriage. It was your best friend's child. Just a relationship. It was the song that had called you home. The seabed where you'd rested your aching bones.
மழை பெய்த நாள். மழை பெய்த நாளொன்றில் சூரியனை முத்தமிட ஆசைப்பட்டது கதிர்நாவாய் பூச்சி. ஆசையை இலைகளிடம் சொல்ல இலைகள் சந்தோஷப்பட்டன. காதோடு கிளைகளுக்கு சொல்ல பித்து கொண்டு போயிற்று காற்று கதை பரப்ப. நெடுந்தூரம் பறக்க சிறகுகளை பித்து கொடுத்தன தூக்கணாங்குருவிகள். பெருமழையில் பாரங்களுடன் பறப்பது கடினமென்று துயரங்களை வாங்கி கொண்டன மர அட்டைகள். புதிதாய் பூத்த பூசணி பூக்களில் தேனெடுத்து கொடுத்தன தேனீக்கள். நிலத்தோடு முட்டி மண்ணை வாரிக்கொண்டு வந்தது கடல். நீரில் மூழ்கி முத்தெடுத்து கொடுத்தது நீர்க்குதிரை. முகம் சிவந்து தலை கவிழ மகனந்தத்தின் மணியெடுத்து அழகிய கவிதை எழுதி கொடுத்தன வண்ணத்து பூச்சிகள். மழை பெருகி பெய்து வழிந்த நாள் பெருமழை முழுதுமாய் தலையில் கொட்டி கன்னத்தில் நனைந்து வழிய சூரியனை தழுவி இழுத்து வந்தது. இழுத்து வந்து வயல்வெளியில் கிடத்தி முத்தமிட்டு மகிழ்ந்தது கதிர்நாவாய் பூச்சி.
Circled by Circe. After 20 years muzzled in North London, you tell me over a cup of treasured Tangana tea, you have decided you must now go back. Back home to that repository of such complicated images to find a less constricting mask, an unthrottle, an old lion in your throat. You kneel before a temporarily placed music center. As the record spins, I listen and try to understand how you imagine your future will unravel from such a private past. You have been heading for this announcement over many years. Each time we met, your conversation grew more spiced, with images of gold sand, tamarind trees, the cacophony of traffic, lorries, cars, bullock carts, bicycles, rising out of the deep roar of the sea, soothing life in a Vellavatta boarding house. Have you found in Old Gaul Road a histogram for the politics of development, a place for the dry knowledge you extracted from that heap of economics textbooks? How quickly they invaded those bookshelves that once encased armloads of dog-eared poetry and far-flung magic histories. For 20 years you dug your heels and watched the catkins' obstinate return. You inscribed Keats, Marx, Parnavithana on every inch of your eclectic skin to come finally to such disillusion. Now you say you must measure your roots and distance yourself from an increasingly hostile climate. It seems you must exchange one mirror image for its reverse. Confound exile and pin your hopes on a fragile memory of things as they might have been.
ආයුබෝවන් උතුරටත් දකුණටත් යුද උල්පත් මවන පාලක කැනිහිලුන් නසබඩ දිවිපිදූ යාපන පුස්තකාලය නුඹට මලගම් ලියූ උන් මෙලොව නැතුවාය යහතින් කිසිවෙකුත් නොවැසුව නඩුවකට තීන්දුව තිලින කොට ඇත සොබාදම් විනිසුරු තැන අවදියෙන් ඉනුමැන යලිදුවොයි සෙවණැලි පුනරාගමනය නොවන්නට මනු දහම ලියවුණු පොත්පත් තිරු තුලට කැවිය යුතුයමය කළු කුහර ගහන වූ ඉතිහාසය යලි යලිත් සිදු නොවිය යුතු රහස
வணக்கம். நான் திருக்குமரன், ஈழத்தைச் சேர்ந்த கவிஞன். இன்று நான் உங்களோடு பகிர்கின்ற கவிதை இப்படியாக புத்தன் மறைந்தான். சுரக்கின்ற ஊற்றாய் இதம் ததும்பும் குளிராய் தன்னில் கரைந்து உருகி உயிராய் இருந்த ஜசோதராவிடமும் மகனிடமும் ஓர் வார்த்தை சொல்லாமல் திருட்டுத்தனமாய் இரவில் வீட்டை விட்டு தப்பியோடிய சித்தார்த்தன் என்பு உருக இவனை தேடி அவர்கள் அழும் பொழுதொன்றில் உலகின் முன் அன்பை போதிக்கும் புத்தனானான். அவனுள் அறுத்து கொண்டிருந்த அந்த முரண்நகை ஓர் விதையை பிரசவித்த போது அது துளிர்த்து வெள்ளரசானது. அவசர அவசரமாய் அதன் கிளையொன்றை முறித்து கொண்டு ஈழத்தீவில் இறங்கினாள் சங்கமித்தை. அவள் அன்று நட்டுச் சென்றது அன்பின் கிளையல்ல. அவள் அன்று நட்டுச் சென்றது அன்பின் கிளையல்ல. ஆற்றொணா வலியின் முடிவற்ற துயரின் கிளை காதல் வழிய காத்திருந்தோரின் ஏக்கம் நிறைந்த கண்ணீரில் வளர்ந்த கிளை பாவம் நிறைந்த கிளை படர்ந்து அரசான போது ஒவ்வொரு இலை நின்றும் எழுந்த தாயினதும் மகனினதும் தவிப்போலம் காதைக்குடைய தனியாளாய் வலியை தாங்கொணாத புத்தன் பூர்வீக மக்களிடம் அதனை பிரித்து கொடுத்துவிட்டு காவிக்குள் மறைந்து கரைந்தான். நன்றி.
නලගත ඔය ආසම කළේ මගේ නලගතට කුන්තක රදනක චාර්වක අග පුරස් චාර්වක හැමෝටම තියෙනවනේ කිය වැනුවේම මේ නලගත බැන්දදා ෆොටෝ ගද්දි වහගෙන ඉඳද්දි කට ඔයාමයි ආයෙමත් hina වෙන්නයි කීවේ මට පෙන්නන්න මේ නලදත දෙන්නේ දත් ටික බඩට යන්න කියා කම්මුලට එන කනක් මිරිකපු යාළුණු දවස්වල පපුවට මුණ ඔබ කෝලං කළා මිස හිතුවය ඉස්සරහා දත් දෙක කැඩෙන්න දෙයි කියලා නල දතත් හෙල්ලෙන්න දත් නැතුව බත් අම්බන්න වෙයි කියලා දවසක ගල් වෙන්න.
The Civil War, September 1984. 3 months since I returned to Sri Lanka with an American college degree. The Civil War has spilled beyond the northern province. Metal gates to my parents' house still bear the dents of rock-throwing mobs. There are axe marks on the wooden doors. New plaster hides a ceiling charred by a burning tire. Embattled elsewhere, I relive the horror of July 1983 through my siblings' eyes. It is difficult to articulate the deep loss within, the negation of familiar fictions, the awareness that exile in one's own country is even less bearable than at a distance. It is a loss compounded by my family's fear. February 1985. Carrying the national ID card is mandatory. It will protect me from arbitrary arrest, they say. But the civil war has spilled beyond the northern province. Authorities have collapsed many identities into a Tamil last name. The card does not attest that I am also Sinhalese, speak no Tamil, and dream in English. It is silent on conflicting loyalties and the struggle to recover myself from colonialisms. I am reduced to someone else's definition, terrorized into keeping boundaries I neither constructed nor consented to. December 1985. Exile, 4 months in North America. White graduate classmates are puzzled that a 20th century South Asian might share the experiences of a medieval Jew. Their imagination stops at my brown skin. There has always been a civil war beyond the northern province. Those at risk cannot afford ignorance. I have learned to recognize the languages of domination and gather a community of resistance for a dangerous journey towards necessary transformations.
So we had some readings there from our poets. Some of them couldn't be here today. So I'm now going to read 3 poems from the anthology, and then Shash is going to read 3 poems. And I'll begin with one of my own poems, This poem is called Ceylon, and it's about tea. You could probably write, some sort of brilliant book about Sri Lanka just in terms of tea. And it's got a couple of words in it which you might need explaining. The names of poetic feet, an I am and a trochee. So an I am goes da-dum, and the trochee goes dum-dum. Ceylon. The words on the tip of your tongue, or as you say, tongue, as we take tea. Waiting for you to speak, I sip mine. Tetley's tastes of nothing, but I suppose it's good to know true flavorlessness, the prose of life we sugar over the first. Ceylon, you say, a trochee, not an iam, referring to the drink I drink with 2 spoonfuls of home, and here, none. Though by home, I mean the house my parents live in and where I grew up. Like and unlike them saying back at home, when they intend Sri Lanka and not Leeds, where they live and I haven't, not for years. And this next poem I'm going to read is by Sunil Govinag, who has written poetry in Sinhala since 1965 and poetry in English since 1989. So he taught himself the language when he was 17. And he's based in Australia, and he's published 7 books of poetry. This poem's called On Becoming an Intellectual. You have lost your third world touch, he said, when I talked to Derrida and Foucault. He thought they were Tamil terrorists. Then I explained. He said, be pragmatic, look for simplicity. Philosophy is dead and nutty. Literature doesn't make you rich. Try to improve on your accent and consider doing an MBA. He showed me the key to his brand new car. I walked to the station. And finally, before handing over to Shash, I'm going to read a poem called The Moon and New York City, which is by Mahagama Sekara. And this is a really important figure. Mahagama Sekara died in 1976. This is a person who's a poet, a lyricist, playwright, a novelist, an author, a translator, and a filmmaker, a really significant figure in Sinhala poetry and literature, who's inspired generations of writers, and someone who was inspired by Japanese poetry as well as by English and French free verse. The Moon and New York City. Only black, competitively upward thrusting concrete walls. No iridescent blue-green sky, leaf, tree, or view to rest the eye. In the city named New York, atop a 100-story closed-in tower, cell, doors and windows sealed, a bed, a chair, a table, me. On the other side, this huge urn, loved ones, parents, kinsmen, friends, children, wife, they come tomorrow. To drive out dead desolation, I sing out loud a verse. The sound rebounds my voice on my own ear. I know not where to go. I open the window and peer deep into the abyss. Sharp piercing forms of cold rush in before my face. Caught in a flood of electric lights, vehicles howling rush in all directions. Stunted ant-like man-machines impatiently lie in the bed. Is there not one stop moment that look at me kindly and ask how I am? Some passing faint. Nobody, not you. I forget. They are all on the other side of the earth. In despair, I gaze upwards. Shining, shining in the sky, a golden plate, the moon, one I know well. The moon that shines above our village high school. The moon that every boy and night lights up the bow tree in our temple there. And that's translation by Ramjan. hand over to Shash.
I'm going to read a poem by Suresh Kanagaraja, who is he's a professor of applied linguistics at Penn State University in the US. He was very influential during the 1980s scene in Jaffna from a Tamil heritage, and has lived abroad since the late 80s. So this poem has I love this poem because it talks to how life carries on amidst all the carnage. There's a reference to Palali in line 3, which is the Air Force base that was in Jaffna, that was built by the British in 1945, and it's used by the Sri Lankan Air Force. Lavanya's Twilight Bike Ride. A damp, prematurely darkening late October evening. The shells from Palali explode near, drowning the monsoon thunder. A jeep whizzes past with 15-year-olds clutching AK-47s to the battle site, crushing the jasmines on the wayside. From the other side hobble tractors with the mangled remains of fighters. As they pile the bodies on the ground, blood mingles with rainwater, streaming along the wheel marks to revive the roots of the creeper. In neighbouring campgrounds, camouflaged girls play hopscotch, their guns resting against palmyras. Smell of fresh baked bread distracts as the baker's boy cycles past, while the 6 o'clock Marchetti bombers make the day's last run towards cadre bunkers. I slow down for mothers listlessly crossing the road with provisions to cope with tomorrow's uncertainties. Business is brisk at the junction shops, where Mudalalis bargain militantly, making the best of today's certainties. An eye on the whirring chopper overhead, and wary of its machine gun fire, I take my year-old Lavanya on her favourite evening bike ride. The next poem I'm going to read is by Seni, who obviously was hugely part of this book and unfortunately can't be here for this first event, and so obviously we had to mark her presence. Dear Mum, not a word from you until today. I was pegging out the washing, and it was as if you were there next to me, reaching to fasten a sheet in loops on my washing line. You were always a say it like it is, speak as you find, no nonsense, some might call it sharp-tongued kind of person. So your silence had surprised me. And there's no criticism implied. I'm grateful to you for teaching me to speak my mind, and for the cushion of love, the space of comfort in the crook of your arm. I've been wondering about your war years, how it felt to be the one he left behind in 1941, and all the waiting. You wrote letters. Your sister helped you with the spelling. Not your fault you were taken out of school at 13 to be the one who helped at home. What with my grandma having her mother and a sick relative to look out for. That bout of TB when you were 6 can't have helped. Nearly 2 months alone in a sanatorium, you told me no visitors allowed. Looking out for them every day. Must have been 5 years before you saw my dad again, and not knowing whether he'd survive, not to mention the posting to Ceylon, the worry he'd decide to stay on. It was a long engagement for sure, but the wedding photo tells its own story. Head held high, you looked around at all the guests as if to say, See, he was worth the wait. I'll write more soon. Glad you came to break the silence. I could still hear your voice, those broad Yorkshire vowels asking me, why is your dad getting all the attention? I can really hear Seni's voice in that poem. Fantastic. And the last poem I'm going to read is one of my own. My grandfather's house. There is moss growing in the bedrooms of my grandfather's house, green and sticky, staining the walls and the floor with shades of the sea. They climb, tracing intricate patterns around brown squares where pictures used to hang. The roof has fallen in. Water stagnates on a cushioned floor as disturbed bats circle, drawing the nights in. The rooms are empty of all that was him. The doors have been locked, warped and unwilling to open onto a tomorrow which does not contain him. It is 6 o'clock, and the mosquitoes gather noisily in rooms that once smelt of sweet margosa leaves. They are the music makers, the sum total of our dreams, the inheritors of rooms that reek and sweat in angry dismay. There is moss growing in the bedrooms of my grandfather's house, and raindrops sing a lament on deserted floors.
Thank you, Shash. That's beautiful. And I totally agree about hearing Seni's voice. I think it's that last line of that poem. I definitely heard it. So I think we have some time for questions and answers now. Maybe just while people are coming up with questions, I just wanted to say that this is a pandemic book as well, in a way, because it was put together during the years of the pandemic. And one of the things I really valued about that was sort of my online friendship with Shash and Seni during those years. When my family had moved to the US and couldn't see our relatives in the UK, let alone Sri Lanka, there was the travel ban and all of that. And how much it meant to me week on week to be able to chat with Shash, who I still haven't met in person, incredibly, and also with Seni, and to hear Seni's Yorkshire accent. Because as Neil pointed out, there's a kind of north of Sri Lanka here thing too, in terms of Shashlight. But there's also a Northern England thing here as well, and to have those sorts of connections. So it's a book about connections from all over the world. It's also a book made in that way, connections.
Yes, I think the phrase was Northern internationalism, wasn't it?
Yes, that's brilliant. We need to hang on to that.
Yes, and I was going to ask you a question about a pandemic-related question, actually, about the possibilities of keeping events hybrid or on Zoom, or what it might mean for diasporic poetry networks, or indeed poetry readers in any one country, or availability of books. But we've also got a couple of questions in the chat. One asking, how are you continuing this network? That's from Kathleen, a Sri Lankan who writes poetry and who also has a cousin who's writing poetry. And how can poets currently in Sri Lanka or Sri Lankan poets join or be part of such networks?
That's a wonderful question. And please do get in touch with me and Shash, and do write to us, our email addresses. But in terms of actually keeping alive some sort of network this way, we're still thinking about art and Shash. What's the best way of doing that technologically, like offline and online?
Yeah, I think we would love to carry on working with the poets in a more sort of direct way. And one thing we realized doing this book, that because people aren't talking to each other, I mean, just getting poets together, conversing, translating from Tamil to Sinhala, from Sinhala to Tamil into English, all of this sort of communication, it's only going to help the country. So I think if we could have a coalition of the willing, it'd be great. It's something that we would really like to take forward. Early days still, but we will be doing something. Absolutely.
Thank you. And you mentioned that people could email you, and would they be able to, how would they find you? Would that be through the Blood Act website or?
Well, I mean, I don't mind saying my email address is just vidyan.ravinthiran@gmail.com. But yeah, sure, you can contact us through Blood Act if that's easier. And I think my faculty webpage should be Googleable as well, so there'll be a link to that.
So there are a few more questions in the chat. And one is Maz saying amazing poetry, thank you. And how were you able to keep the original poet's voice in your translations? And kind of bundling that together with one from Jeremy Noel Todd, which is thanks for such an interesting discussion, everyone. You spoke interestingly about looking for formal qualities in the poems you choose. Were there any particular forms or genres that you noticed as characteristic of contemporary Sri Lankan poetry, or is it not possible to generalize?
Those are both really interesting questions. The first one, I think, has got to go to you, Shash.
Yeah, I think you're sort of getting into the sort of translation debate at the moment. It's when you translate, you are using the thought processes of the poet you're translating, but it's really important to recognize that the end product is not the original poets, it's the translators. And that's something that is lacking in Sri Lankan translation at the moment, and something that needs to be addressed. This slavish faithfulness to the source text has to be broken away from, to allow translators the space to be creative. And because they can be creative, the poems they produce in their target language will be poems and not just a verbatim mirror of something that has been written using different conditions, linguistic conditions and constraints and poetics. So I'd love to do loads more work with translators and just to allow them the freedom to let their own voice go, because voice isn't something that you really worry about when you're translating.
There's a lovely discussion going on. Sorry, Vidyan, did you want to continue with that? Because I didn't want to miss out on...
Oh, sure. No, I was just going to very quickly
Yeah.
say something, Jeremy, and to just thank you for the question, and to say that I think that with Tamil poetry, there is a poetry of witness and a certain kind of tradition, which Shash could speak about much better than I can. But in terms of the Anglophone Sri Lankan poetry, I don't think I do see it consolidating right now into any particular style. I think that's made the book quite exciting because we've got prose poems and we've got lyric poems and we've got sort of post-lyric, and we've got writers who come from performance backgrounds and all sorts. So there's a sort of exciting diversity there in that front for people who buy the book. In terms of the lineage of Sri Lankan poetry and what's happening with some Sri Lankan Anglophone poetics, I think we need a stronger cultural memory there, actually, and to sort of be aware of writers from the past and how we might want to take their writing forward. And I hope this book can be part of it.
Okay, there are a couple of questions, one from an anonymous attendee and one from Seneviratne, I think. And these are about any aesthetic qualities that you might have found shared between the three languages, or threads of continuity in Sri Lankan poetry from pre-independence to now, both of which points I think you've addressed slightly already. But these are really questions looking at commonality and continuity rather than difference and proliferation.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think with Tamil poetry has got a very long tradition of rooting poems in landscapes. And it's called Thinne, and there are 5 major landscapes, and each landscape has its own flora and fauna. It's all very formulaic, and you locate poems within the landscape, and that gives the reader an awareness of the sub-narrative. And this process has been going on for like 2,000 years, and poets still use it. And you find the modern poets have sort of broken it, but also with diasporan poetry, because you've got exiled. You've got whole new landscapes coming in. So you've got the northern wintry landscape, you've got snow, you've got autumn with leaves being shed. And so you've got very exciting new landscapes being formed. In some ways, Sinhala poetry also, they don't have this formulaic set of landscapes. but it is also very rooted in a very Sri Lankan landscape, which we discovered. And they're not very political, the Sinhala writers. And one of the biggest criticisms that poets from the north had during the Civil War was that the Sinhala writers did not address the politics of the time, that they were rooting their poetry in a sort of a pastoral idyll, you know, talking about love and family when there was bloodshed going around. So yeah, the use of landscapes is really interesting, and it comes through in the whole book as well.
I'm just seeing the questions that Anthony's put in the chat. I know we have to wind down now, but just to say, if anyone wants to get in touch and, you know, ask these questions on email or chat or anything, both of us are very willing to do that. I'd love to talk. I'm just seeing what the questions are. How we found and connected with poets. Oh, it was a nightmare some of the time. It was like sort of every possible means. You know, I found myself using Facebook far more than, you know, I'd like to. Often that was one of the ways, and you sort of find a relative and then you sort of try and trace your way back to the poet. And some of these things took a long time. We made some friends along the way, which was nice too. And choosing representatively, well, that is a really good question. And that really, we had some long editorial meetings in the Shash, and it's a bit Seni's which is a huge part of that. And we had to make some difficult decisions, but you know, we had some arguments between us as well. We were really good friends, but it was quite intense sometimes. Okay, it's 2 p.m. I have to stop.
I can be found on Twitter, and I will always reply.
The book is published on the 22nd of June. It's available from the Bloodaxe website, and we hope it will be available from Fox Lane Books shortly.
And thank you so much to my colleagues for speaking today, and also to you, the audience, for your wonderful questions and your desire to connect. Also, I would just like to put in one personal note, which is thank you again so much to the speakers for covering such a wide and creative and challenging realm of poetry. And I really hope this book will be in everyone's hands by Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.